Okay, so we're now on to the very important topic of coping. So this is about how can a family member help their loved one to cope better with puzzling voices and distressing paranoid thoughts and beliefs. What can we actually do within the family to support the other treatments that are available? Now, the first question that comes up is anybody good at coping? How do we cope with our own problems? We all have our own individual strategies and styles. And sometimes it's a good starting point to think, how do I cope with my caring role or my work problems or whatever life might throw at you? And then having to think about ourselves, reflecting on what strategies our loved one uses in an attempt to cope. So, this is my exploration of my own coping strategies. Again, I had to be ruthlessly honest with myself in terms of what I do when the going gets tough. Now, the first thing that became apparent was I have a tendency to get my head down and just soldier on, despite the fact that things might not be resolving or working out particularly well. I just bash on with what I've been doing. Now, that is best described as a denial style. It's kind of a denial of the things that are round about me, and it's certainly not a helpful coping style. The next thing that I observed during my reflection is that I have a tendency to ruminate about things. Now, there's two types of rumination. Sad rumination, which kind of says, oh, why did this happen to me? What a shame, sort of a thing. And there's the rumination that says, how dare they do this to me? They shouldn't be doing that. And mine's is the externalizing rumination of people are treating me unfairly. Now, what that kind of rumination style does, it's a way of coping, but it fuels anger and frustration. And it never helps. If anything, it can lead you down a pathway of getting increasingly emotionally upset, and you end up saying or doing something which isn't very helpful. So this ruminatory style that I developed fits in with this externalizing bias. Everybody else is to blame when things go wrong. Now, this is actually a style very common in paranoia. All the fault is out there and none of it is in here. So it's quite interesting to reflect on your own coping styles. So I would say those first three are really unhelpful and could do with being changed. We then come to some more useful ones. I have a tendency to be logical and try and think my way through what the problems actually are and how they can be addressed. I've also, particularly through my time in CBT, developed a style of setting short-term goals, which are usually achievable within a short time frame. That's useful. I've also come to recognize the signs of burnout or early burnout. Now, it must be said, very many mental health professionals are so stressed that they have burnout symptoms. And these can be things like fatigue, poor sleep, um, lack of enjoyment in work, poor concentration, etc. So recognizing signs of burnout is a useful style. And I've developed a style of walking for about an hour each day in the fresh air, a brisk walk. So I'm getting exercise, which is a good coping strategy, and I'm getting fresh air, which is good to clear the mind and give you time to reflect. So, what you can see in my coping strategies and styles is a mixed bag. And reflecting on it, there's good things in there, and there are things which I would like to change. And maybe at the end of this session, as part of the exercise, you might reflect on your own mixed bag of effective and ineffective coping strategies and styles. Now, there was a famous study done by Marius Rom and Sondra Escher about people who coped with voices and who were working normally in the community, living normal lives, and people who didn't cope with them, and they were distressed enough to report them to the primary care physician and would end up in psychiatry. So Roman Escher looked at the differences between these two types of voice hearers. Those that coped had a stronger self-esteem. They believed they were stronger than these voices. They tended to have more positive voices, but they did also get a lot of negative voices. They had fewer voices which gave commands. They were able to set more limits to the voices, give them periods of time which we would listen to them and reflect on them, and they would practice selective listening. They would take components of the voice hearing and think, oh, that's quite interesting. That reminds me of something that once happened at school or a particular life event. And the ones that coped were much more able to talk about their voices. Some of them gave lectures about voice hearing. And I think what you can see there is a particular relationship with the voices and a particular component of robust self-esteem and taking charge. That relationship with the voices is where we want to get to. So the patients who were hearing voices, were very distressed by them, were in psychiatric services, often had the belief that they were weaker than the voices. Now that's something that we can change. They often experienced more critical and negative voices and had more voices giving commands. So they were kind of passive and feeling controlled by the voice hearing experience. They tended to have a lower self-esteem, lower self-worth. They often wouldn't dare set an appointment time for the voices each day, didn't put limits on them. And they would often try to drown the voices out or escape using various types of distraction. And the commonest is the headphones or the earplugs, playing music really quite loud to try and drown the voices out. So these are two very different styles for a similar voice hearing experience. And what we see is with the relationship with the voices that the copers have is that the voice hearing changes as the relationship changes. So in our clients and loved ones who aren't coping, we want to change their relationship with their voice hearing experience. And anything we can do to improve self-esteem is also very important. So what about the ways that people cope then? I mean, I think this is a real eye-opener. Left to develop their own coping strategies in the face of voice hearing and distressing paranoid thoughts, most loved ones will do things to cope which will make their voices and paranoia worse. They usually generate an ineffective strategy. So this is a great place where family members can help. Now, I think this is kind of analogous to the problem of you're playing golf one day and you come off the course with a sore back. You've got muscular back pain. And if you decide, oh, that's really quite painful, I'm going to spend the rest of the day lying on the sofa. When you attempt to get off that sofa at dinner time, you discover your back's worse because the muscles have now gone into spasm. What they needed was to be exercised gently and moved. The coping strategy of resting has made the pain worse. So it's a bit like that with loved ones who are struggling to cope with voices and delusions. So this is a study we did on about 300 people with voice hearing. And these were people who were attending hearing voices groups in the community. And these are very supportive groups, mostly found in continental Europe, also found in the UK. So the first column showed the typical coping strategies which people used. And we got them to describe their coping strategy, and we then worked out whether they were trying to escape from the voices, that is a distraction technique, or whether it was a technique to focus on the voice and change the relationship with them, or whether they were actually doing something very different to change the relationship in a very substantial way. So these were the strategies which these people had generated to deal with their voices in the community. Now, if you look at the first bar, this is the number of people who were trying to escape. They were using distraction strategies. It was usually loud music, and the bottom bit of the bar is the number of times we were able to agree as a research team that what they were doing was actually making it worse. So we only have the very small bit at the top of that first bar where there was some disagreement and it was thought that the strategy might actually be useful. So most people use distraction, and the team thought that it was usually an unhelpful coping strategy. Now, that's not to say that distraction is an unhelpful approach. We need to start with an effective distraction strategy and then move into focusing so that we can start to change the relationship. So some people were focusing on the voice hearing experience, and what they were tending to do was to shout back at the voices. Now, shouting back at them is a way of focusing, but it's inefficient and it's linked to anger, and anger always worsens voice hearing. So the team, looking at these focusing approaches, agreed in terms of the vast majority that what they were doing was making it worse. And there was only a small minority who we thought this focusing approach might be working. As you can see, there's only a small number of people that have actually progressed to a metacognitive change. Now, these are styles, which means they are in a new and different relationship with the experience. But even some of them didn't seem to be doing it in a way that would help. The sum total of this exploration is that coping with something strange like voice hearing is something that naturally we do very badly. And that would go for any of us developing the experience, unless we had that robust self esteem and the knowledge to know what was going on and to master that interaction with the voice quite early on. So, what about these different coping styles that we saw? So, distraction techniques are about escape from paranoia or drowning the voices out. But they can also be about finding something which will take the edge off the experience so that you can enter a social situation, do some voluntary work, etc. So to have a good distraction strategy is very important, because you know then you can take the edge off those unpleasant voices. Focusing techniques are about trying to say, what is this experience about? It's about trying to understand it better. And if you have to live with these voices, how are you going to manage that relationship with them? Same with paranoid beliefs. How are you going to manage that? And the metacognitive techniques are top level coping. And this is about taking a whole new approach to it. And the examples are things like practicing mindfulness or acceptance or altruism. So we have a list of 60 effective coping strategies. The first 30 are distraction techniques, and all of these, somebody with voice hearing has told me this worked for me, that's how it got onto the list of 60. Now, when we look at the things that are in the list of 60 that are effective distraction techniques, it's not about drowning the voices out or escape from the paranoia. It's about doing something to occupy the cortex, something to allow the person with voice hearing to be focused. So instead of listening to music, you could actually try and pick up playing an instrument again. And many of our loved ones have got a guitar somewhere or another instrument that they once had a shot at. Now, the important thing about music is when you're playing an instrument, the cortex is very busy. There's chords, there's tune, there's rhythm, there's the words of any song, and it can even become a social thing where you play music with somebody else. So I've seen people recover by learning an instrument. The same thing in terms of learning another language. Even small phrases of another language can be very useful. If we're going to be listening to music, which is what many people choose as the first option, then let's think about using a type of music which isn't repetitive, but which is harmonic and lyrical and which has some kind of meaning, because that is much more engaging for the cortex and it will be a more effective coping strategy. But the question is, can we get our loved one to switch from what they're currently listening to something which we might think is more lyrical? I know that one of my most recent successes with this was a client who listened to the music of Eminem and actually found that to be very useful. And interestingly he said to me, what he writes is interesting, but he's also very assertive. And there was something with that combination in the music which is useful. So we need to explore musical options and see what might work best. Can we practice shifting attention? Because many people are locked in to hearing the voice. They just sit listening to these voices for hours on end. But you can have an attention shifting practice time where you practice listening to the radio, listening to the traffic, and then listening to your watch, and you keep practice shifting attention, and that can help you de-attend to the voice. I've had people recover through the use of art. Now, part of the problem here is that if someone says, they look at the list of 60 and they say, I would quite like to try and paint. I'm not bad at art. Maybe I could paint these voices. And in the painting of the voices is the beginnings of recovery and a change in that experience. So I've seen people recover through the use of art, but this might mean you need to go to the art shop, buy an easel, some canvases, and some paints. So there can be financial cost to these coping strategies. What about walking and exercise? These are good coping strategies. Pets are very useful because it means you have a caring relationship towards a dog or another animal of some kind. And that, of course, gives you the option of getting out and about and exercising too. Writing is very useful, particularly writing about the voices or writing the themes that they talk about. I had one chap who wrote the voices down as they spoke, and he said that this was helpful. It gave him something to do when the voices were speaking. Watching films and videos is useful. I had one young man with very, very frightening voices, and he said, I cope by watching horror films. And I said, is there any chance we could switch to a different type of film and see if that has any effect on the voice hearing? So he switched to comedy and found this was better. This helped him distract. So it's about exploring what they currently do to distract and seeing if we can change it. And the same thing is true of computer games, which obviously a lot of our loved ones will be involved in playing, often too much of. What about the type of game, and can we limit the amount of time spent on them? So that's distraction, and we need a good distraction technique for voices and paranoia. Something that works, something that takes the edge off. But we then need to move. We can't stay in distraction. We need to move to focusing. That is to try to start and make sense of why these people might be out to get me, or what the voices are trying to communicate, or where they might come from in my past. So the idea here is that there are things in the content of the voices which are personally meaningful and which are worth attending to for a period. This might be that my confidence is very low. I wonder if I could improve my confidence. Or I wonder if I could be a bit kinder to myself. Or maybe the voices are talking about old arguments, stresses, or life events. Maybe we can think about what those were about and try to leave them in the past. So while we're selective listening, we use a technique to allow us to do that. And things like breathing exercises, working out if the voice has got it right, working out if the voice is telling the truth, or working with an underlying belief or schema. The voices seem to be criticizing me all the time, and telling me that I'm a failure. Well, is that person really a failure? Can we look at the evidence for that and look at the periods of success that they have had in their life and focus on those success experiences while listening to the voices and trying to understand them? So we move from switching them off a bit to trying to get a better understanding of what these voices are talking about. And then we move into a new relationship with the voices, which might be something like being mindful when the voices are active, or displaying an attitude of acceptance. Okay, these voices are part of my life now, but they're not going to hold me back. I'm going to press on now and hit some targets. So, what about these techniques then? Staying in the house. Well, that's really an avoidance strategy. And that is the kind of thing that keeps the voices going. We would view that as a safety behavior. If they don't have too many negative symptoms, and if they're able at this point to get out of the house, we would say it's easier to test these voices out and get control of them when we're getting a bit of social activity. So, staying in the house, probably not a good one. What about speaking to a friend on the phone about the voices? This is what we call a voice buddy. And this is a really good idea because you've got somebody to speak to who might know about your voice hearing or might themselves be a voice hearer, and you can phone up and talk through what the voices are saying and the upset that you feel about it and get that kind of befriending type of support. So a voice buddy is a good thing. It also means that you're trying to take control of it. Mindfulness is a good thing, but best to use brief pulses and not spend long, long periods of time doing any kind of meditative technique. Loud music, we've mentioned, is probably not such a good technique. What about talking back to the voices? This is part of the focusing approach. So you're listening to what they're trying to communicate to you, and you're having some kind of internal or external into a phone or writing down feedback to what the voices are saying to you. So that can be useful. What about worry? Is worry a useful style? Never. It's never a good approach to be repetitively worrying. So here we have a mixture of different techniques, some helpful and some not. So how can we use distraction techniques? This is an example of a young man who is very preoccupied with voice hearing. He has distressing, continuous voices. They're very critical of him and tell him to harm himself, as they sometimes do. He uses this technique of playing music very loud, trying to drown the voices out, but the voices keep trying to overwhelm the loud music, and it's a battle that the voices tend to win. So could he switch to some kind of different music if that's the style that is most important to him? And in this case, a patient of mine said, I remember a song that once meant a lot to me, and it was a song by a group called the Fun Loving Criminals called Up in the Hill. Now, this is a piece of music that for him was highly significant, and I won't go into why, but it was about a certain period in his life and things that happened then. So when you ask a loved one, is there a particular bit of music that we might try to play instead of this very powerful, heavy stuff, they can sometimes come up with something which can be a key to unlock the voices. up on the hill allowed him to start to think about what was happening at that time. And as he played this very melodic and meaningful music to him, the voices backed off. So we want to choose, if it's going to be music, certain types of music which are meaningful, and then we can maybe move from distraction into focusing. So as he listened to Up on the Hill, he started to find what the voices were talking about. And we laughed about this as being a message in a bottle. So, like, there's a great sea of voices out there, and mostly the water is choppy and the sea is stormy, but there's a bottle floating in there with a message in it. So, as he went to that time in his life about Up on the Hill, we were able to understand what some of that voice hearing was about. And as he did so, his relationship changed with the voice. He was able to set boundaries to it. His self-esteem grew. The voices became a bit more positive and a bit less critical, and stopped telling him to hurt himself. And he started to write a diary about that time in his life. And as he wrote the diary and started to check out with people that were there at the time, he made sense of what these particular voices were talking about. So what about rumination? I mentioned this as something I do. It's really not a good strategy if you want to cope with something. So think of the last time you had a right good ruminate. I'm talking about hours of rumination. What was the situation? Did this strategy upset you or help? And did it resolve the problem? I once had an academic manuscript rejected by one of the big medical journals, and the referees were quite critical of it. And I ruminated and ruminated about the unfairness of how this excellent paper hadn't been accepted. I never got it accepted because of that rumination. I got it accepted when the next day I realized the actual ideas that the referee had that would improve the paper. And I went back to the drawing board and put that into action, and it was accepted. The rumination, I could have ended up sending a really hostile email off to the editor, which would have done me tremendous harm. Rumination often causes upset and leads to actions which are downright inefficient. We mentioned worry. Now, lots of people with paranoia and persecutory delusions are worrying all the time about what's going to happen. Now, worry doesn't reduce anxiety. Worry increases anxiety. Worry doesn't make you safe. Worry leads to paralysis so that you're not actually solving your problems. Worry doesn't get you ready to deal with those people who you think are out there and want to harm you. Worry makes voices and delusions worse. So, worry, as with rumination, is not an effective style. So, if a loved one is doing that, we would like to help them to reduce their worry. The way of doing this is consider worry. Does it ever deliver a result, or is it inefficient? What about postponing the worry and having a worry period or worry appointment for 15 minutes each evening? And whenever you notice yourself worrying, you say, no, I'm not doing that now. I'm going to do it at 6 o'clock tonight. And you just keep postponing it till 6. Of course, when you get to 6, you try and worry. For some reason, it's hard to do so. So worry postponement and worry periods are useful. Thought suppression. A lot of loved ones with psychosis are exhausted because they get frightening thoughts intruding into their consciousness. These might be sexual or violent thoughts, might be religious thoughts that they're upsetting, they don't want them there. And the more that they try to force them out of the mind, the more they come back. So you can't actually force these kind of thoughts away. If you think about the pink polar bear experiment, if you imagine the scene in your mind of a pink polar bear wearing a kilt and it's ice skating on a frozen lake, and just watch it in your mind for a while. Can you see it there? It's doing pirouettes and lovely turns, and people are applauding the pink polar bear wearing the kilt. Now stop thinking it. I bet you that polar bear is still skating in your mind. And this is the idea that thought suppression just doesn't work. You've got to let those unpleasant thoughts just be there for a bit and tell yourself they're just thoughts. Just because I'm thinking it doesn't make it true. And just because I think it doesn't mean I'm going to do it. I'm going to let it be there for a while. I can cope with this. Now, I've mentioned mindfulness, acceptance, and altruism as good places to get to. So people who have recovered have normally used effective distraction, selective listening, and then got on to mindfulness, acceptance, or altruism. So mindfulness, we need obviously to learn how to do that and learn the key concepts. And then we use small pulses of it day to day. And this might be the mindful breath, just being aware of your breathing without any judgment or thoughts about it. Mindful walking. As you walk, you feel the ground under your feet and you're in touch with your mind experiencing that, or mindful eating. There's a lot of other different ways of practicing mindfulness, but doing small amounts on a regular basis is probably the best way to encourage the mindful attitude to life. And this is really of the mind watching the activities of mind and body without judgment. So this can be cultivated with practice. And of course, as you're mindful about voice hearing, voices will start to change because you have changed your relationship with the experience. You can practice mindfulness when the voices are speaking or when paranoid thoughts are surfacing in the mind. Acceptance is a state of mind. It's a state of saying, I've got to get on with life now. I've got to begin to recover. The voices are there. I'll do everything I can to work with them and hit my targets despite whatever they're doing. Write a letter to the voices, accepting their presence and acknowledging that there are things in there that they're trying to tell you to help you. So how can I get to my targets despite this experience? Now, really important with any coping strategy that we're going to try, we've got to practice it. And we should do it with a simple diary when we can score the outcomes. Any new coping strategy for any of us or for our loved one needs preparation and information. The how do I do it needs to be modeled and problems examined together and solutions found. So if a decision is made to listen to jazz music rather than rap, we need to actually make it possible for that to happen. We need to go through that process of working out how we're going to get that music available. We might need to buy things to help with coping, whether that's a yoga mat or borrowing a guitar or going out to the art shop and buying those easels, canvases and paints. We need to score it because we want to know, is this helping or not? And sometimes the initial response to a new coping strategy is the voices get a bit worse. So we need to know that and say, if they get a bit worse initially, that's maybe because we've changed something. Anyway, what does that mean if they're getting a bit worse? Does that mean we're in charge? So we should persevere for 1 week or 2 weeks and score the outcome. And then if the new coping strategy is working, let's practice it. Let's keep it going. And this is where a family member can really be very, very helpful in encouraging and asking about the coping strategy. So this is one of the most recent articles on the subject, and I'm sure we can get a copy of that for you if you're interested in that one. Here's some resources. The Zlepnig CBT website runs live webinars with role plays in it. So you can see some of these things getting role played. So that's a good one to check into. The Psychosis Reach project based in Seattle is doing various kind of training programs for families and supervision sessions. I've mentioned Treating Psychosis, the book, and treatingpsychosis.com, the website, has lots of downloadable things, diaries, information sheets, things that could be useful for CBT informed caring. Intervoice is about voice hearing and has stories of recovery. Paranoidthoughts.com is about paranoia, about delusions, stories of recovery. Stories of recovery are important because they bring hope. We've mentioned the cultural aspects, and there is one book, and Shania Rathod is the lead author, Cultural Adaptations of CBT for Severe Mental Illness. So that might be pertinent. We've got a book with a DVD in the back showing examples of high yield CBT techniques for severe mental illness. And there'll be a book coming out next year called Decoding Delusions, about understanding what's been happening at the roots of delusions. We're going to have a question and answer session, but do this exercise first. And I mentioned this earlier. Consider your own coping strategies and styles, and you'll probably have a mixture of efficient and inefficient ones in relation to any recent difficulty. How effective are these approaches? Is there anything you might try to change? Now consider your loved one's main coping strategy. Is it a helpful one, or making the experience of psychosis actually more stressful? Our research would tend to show that most sufferers are using unhelpful strategies.